I don't know about you guys, but I absolutely adore when vampires are in any type of media. Movies, shows, books, video games. I can't get enough. I will have zero interest in anything someone recommends to me, but as soon as they're like, oh, also, there's this vampire, I am locked in. Say no more. I've been like this for a while. In fact, for years. Which is a very embarrassing thing to admit to the internet. And I started to wonder, why is that? Why do we look at vampires who are literal monsters and just obsess over them? Sure, people would argue that monster-like characters are attractive, but there seems to be more love directed toward vampires specifically. Out of all monsters you could add in romance, why are vampires so high on that list? Especially in terms of popularity. Let's find out about why people love vampires in pop culture and the media, what makes them so attractive, and why we're obsessed. I won't dive too heavily into the history of vampires, mainly because I know a history lesson may seem a little boring to some, but it's imperative in terms of talking about vampires' growth in the media in general. It's been said that vampires go quite a long way back within pop culture. Vampiric stories have been around for centuries, and Native American mythology honored them. And without a doubt, the mythology of vampires has grown since. There are records of vampires in many cultures throughout the world. The term vampire became well known in Western Europe following accounts of a widespread panic in Southeastern and Eastern Europe in the 18th century, which in certain cases led to the staking of dead and the accusation of vampirism. Within this current generation, we see vampires as fictitious, unreal creatures. Cultural customs frequently developed with the intention of preventing the undead rising of those who pass. It was common practice to bury a body upside down and to place earthly things like sickles or scythes beside the grave to ward off demons or to placate the deceased so they would not seek to emerge from their caskets. This technique is similar to the ancient Greek custom of paying the toll to cross the river Styx in the underworld by putting an obelisk in the corpse's lips. It's possible that the coin was also used to keep evil spirits out of the body, which may have had an impact on subsequent vampire folklore. This custom, which involved placing a wax cross and a piece of pottery bearing the words "Jesus Christ conquers" on the corpse to keep it from turning into a vampire, is still present in contemporary Greek folklore concerning the this word. There are other ways to turn someone into a vampire. Getting bitten by one is the most typical approach. Other ways one may turn or have turned include using magic, offing yourself, spreading illness, or a cat leaping over a dead human. Some thought that newborns who were born on Christmas, on Epiphany, or with teeth were more likely to turn into vampires. Although it isn't unknown that vampires heal more quickly than humans do and that they never perish from illness or other common human ailments, there are a number of ways to eliminate them. The most common ones include exposure to sunlight, decapitation, and a wooden stake driven through the heart. In several tales, vampires might only enter a house with permission. In other tales, they might be sidetracked by scattered items, such as grains or seeds, which they must count, giving potential victims a chance to flee. Vampires had always been addicted to counting things. Spreading seeds over the graves of suspected vampires was a common practice in medieval Europe. The idea was that when the vampires attempted to break free from their grave, they would come upon the seeds and become so enthralled with the work of counting them that they would remain in the grave. So like ADHD but vampire version, I guess. Also, I got this source from an interview on Count Von Count, like from Sesame Street. I love doing research for this video. John Polidori's The Vampire was the first vampire tale ever written. The narrative was inspired by the way predators were portrayed in other books. Later on, this tale gave rise to the enormous hit Dracula, although the vampire stereotype took on a variety of forms. The phenomena expanded along with the character's level of popularity. The early 1900s saw the rise in popularity of film as the catalyst for this. The vampire legend spread throughout Hollywood. Popular book adaptations persisted in the 1900s and reached their peak in the 2000s. The vampire subculture flourished in the 2000s thanks to the hit movie series known as Twilight. The Twilight saga expanded following the success of the first film. With the flourish of the principal actors Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson, Twilight took a turn for the better. Vampires gained a lot of popularity in the late 2000s after the release of the first Twilight film. The more popularity Twilight received, so did the concepts of vampires. The main answer to the big "why are vampires so loved" question, based off of what I've seen, was that it's simply a kink to people, which is a reasonable response. And I'm no kink shamer. I've seen what people say about Diabolik lovers. I know you all exist. But even if that's the case, I want to understand that aspect of that answer more. What makes them such a common attraction? Like, hey, why don't I hear people thirsting over Frankie? Huh? I mean, I'm not attracted to him either, but I'm just saying, I don't see y'all lusting over him. Or the big bad wolf, I don't know. Turns out that the concept of bloodlust tends to read quite similar to the plain old thirst, and writers have always portrayed vampires as sexy, intriguing, and frequently gorgeous. This is part of the appeal of vampires. The Gothic era vampires frequently use seduction as a part of their terrible deeds, and the sex appeal angle has grown stronger today because vampires can be morally decent, or at least morally gray, and therefore get to play love interest that the audience is supposed to root for. But there's more to the vampire craze than just that. Vampires originated as a way to represent societal concerns and fears. Naturally, these early vampires frequently symbolized anxieties about cannibalism, death, and the unknown, but they also represented illnesses that were yet poorly understood. As these creatures evolved, vampires came to symbolize societal anxieties over sexual, cultural, and religious deviation. Take Edward, for example. Bella was the only human at her high school that knew of Edward being a vampire, but even then, many still found him fascinating. Those who have been othered by vampires have found a way to relate to them despite their monstrous nature because of their otherness. In relation, the queer community has felt stronger connections to the concept of vampires as well, mainly because they understand what it means to feel like the sexual deviant of society. Monster myths frequently serve as metaphors for many types of societal outcasts. Queerness has long been an especially popular interpretation of vampires, when they have also been employed as metaphors for class conflict, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. These are nocturnal, androgynous creatures. Vapid images of banned sexualities and gender performances have provided queer audiences with coded representations of queer intimacy in media and society, where such depictions are not only frowned upon, but unsafe. Although vampires are associated with many different myths worldwide, their penchant for queerness really came together with Gothic fiction in the late 1800s. In Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel Carmilla, a young lady is enticed by a vampire with nobility. When Bram Stoker, a gay man living in secret, created Dracula in 1897, he was greatly influenced by Le Fanu. Hollywood's oppressive Hays Code, which prohibited sex, violence, and any other sort of perversion, was in effect from the 1930s until the 1960s. It was difficult for American vampire films to survive. Nevertheless, horror movies welcomed the slapstick humor that was required to get past the gatekeepers. In the meantime, blood-sucking women were big on TV. Lily Munster was the vampire housewife of the Munsters, and Vampira hosted her own show from 1954 to 1955. Even on the spotless tiny screen, critics have noted a distinctly lesbian sensibility to the high femme stylings of Gothic matriarchs. In these stories, vampire sucking offers a powerful threat to masculinity. Feminist author Sylvia Kelso writes that it is fellatio, which is viewed as demeaning or corrupting either the woman men own or to men themselves. The way that vampires are interpreted changes as society standards do. Vampires alter to reflect the ways that our perceptions of desire and identity vary. They remain a vibrant and pertinent cultural phenomena, challenging and igniting discussions about the human experience. This flexibility guarantees that vampires will always be a topic of investigation, enticing researchers to examine their complex nature within the framework of changing cultural norms. An urge is created when viewing this kind of media. The urge towards love and the dead, or in this case, undead. The urge occurs because it's forbidden, but that's also what makes it so much easier to get enticed by. In popular culture, vampires are more alluring than just fascinating. It represents the intricate relationship between fear, desire, and the examination of taboo topics. Blood, a key theme in vampire mythology, represents human nature's base urges and forbidden wants. One of the things that sets vampires apart from other creatures is their insatiable bloodlust. The Twilight stories, for example, make premarital sex perilous and make clear the connections between sexuality and mortality. Bella has conjoined cravings for sex and undeath, which Edward tries to control throughout. We also see this occur with Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust, where Charlotte tells Meyer to not only bite her, but to really let him indulge.
Why stop? I want you, Meyer. I want all of you.
Eroticism represents the destruction of the ego, saying that the urge toward love pushed to its limit is an urge toward death. But her longing for death also symbolizes her desire for self-transformation and specific types of capital, like a feminine body that defies age and physical strength that she is unable to achieve in life. The vampire's trademark move is their bite, which they use to proliferate, feed, and ultimately take down prey. However, the bite reveals much more than these three aspects. The bite is like a dance or a flirtation with death. and it's the most intimate and erotic experience one can have with a vampire. Freud's views on the vampire myth are pretty consistent with his dream analysis, which holds that every type of dream imagery suggests the satisfaction of some sort of unconscious sexual desire. For example, according to Freudian psychoanalysis, the vampire is a kind of phantom projection produced by the medium's desire to be possessed, controlled, and vampirized. Morbid dread always signifies repressed sexual wishes. Yes, Freud's theories have been proven wrong a few times, as they can be difficult to verify or even refute, but his ideals on sex are scarily relevant to this day and actually explain how someone's brain can develop. The ID, ego, and superego are three elements or agencies of personality founded by Freud. This theory believes that every individual has a distinct role to play in the development and application of their personality during their adult years. Further investigation into this is that an ID dominance as a regression to a child's psychosexual development mental state. The common portrayal of vampires as having long, pointed fangs may actually be tiny, pointed phallic emblems used to emphasize and signal vampires' oral aggression. Underindulgence throughout a child's oral stage of psychosexual development, most typically in the form of breastfeeding and other forms of sustenance, leads to oral aggression. The thirst and aggressive obsession for pleasure and gratification and need to sustain themselves that the vampires exhibit in all examples of the vampire myth are evident in their Oedipal blood-sucking of their victims. Blood is a key component of vampire mythology, serving as a metaphorical stand-in for sexuality and instinctual behavior. Drinking blood turns into a symbolic act of giving in to forbidden urges. It is sensual, close-knit, and risky all at once. The vampire's bite represents giving in to one's baser desires and losing control, in addition to the pleasure that comes from eating forbidden fruit. This symbolism gives vampire stories depth and enables them to examine the fundamental and emotive struggle between intrinsic impulses and societal limits. If we were to see a vampire having their teeth extracted, we could gain a deeper understanding of the intensely sexual aspect of their oral violence. The removal of the teeth acts as a kind of castration for vampires, rendering them impotent in their need for oral gratification. Just as castration renders males impotent in terms of sexual gratification, the teeth are used as a sexual image of penetrating others in order to fulfill the ID's demands of pleasure. This is consistent with Freud's thesis of castration anxiety, which supports the theory that the vampire myth symbolizes human unconscious sexual impulses resulting from personality-ego conflict. The portrayal of the vampire as a highly sexual entity is another aspect of contemporary retellings of the vampire tale. In order to emphasize the profound sexual characteristics that the vampire has come to represent, the portrayal of the vampire in contemporary adaptations like Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire still incorporates elements of the Gothic Romantic era through language and costume. The vampire myth's intensely violent and sexually charged attraction may also serve as a metaphor for sexual obsession and deviances, which arise from phallic aggressiveness that is generated during the genital age of human psychosexual development. This hypothesis offers more evidence in favor of the Freudian psychodynamic theory, which holds that the vampire myth is a psychological allegory for the unconscious impulses that exist within the human psyche. According to Freud, masochism is a term frequently used to describe people who find suffering enjoyable. Most would frame women with this kind of dynamic. Although women aren't the only ones who could be framed as masochists, Paula Kaplan dissected these presumptions about women's innate masochism and found that they serve to legitimize and normalize women's oppression and subjugation under patriarchy. Furthermore, despite the fact that sadism and masochism are neither inherently masculine nor feminine, respectively, their gendering has endured. Even though the concept is hotly debated, what's most fascinating about it is what masochism implies about gendered subjectivity and intersubjectivity, especially in light of how it functions in romantic vampire stories. According to Jessica Benjamin, masochism is a search of recognition of the self by an other who alone is powerful enough to bestow that recognition. Here she explains how women's subjectivity can be wholly dependent on the male other, a gesture that is particularly central to the dominant hetero-patriarchal romantic myths and more, the Gothic romances. However, masochism has agentic elements as well, leading to their literal desire for undeath. In terms of stories like Twilight, Diabolik Lovers, Vampire Night, and I'm sure more, masochism is operative on many complementary levels, in the physical dangers and eroticized pain characterizing the relationships shown in these stories, and the acquiescence to need protection, and leading women's identities come to be defined solely through their interactions with their male lead and in desire for death, to literalize the idea that they will be together forever. There's that masochistic desire and dependence on the vampiric lead for their physical and psychic stability, and it helps to ensure their subordination. There is a long history for connecting sex with death. The vampire in particular functions as a metaphor for, and actually performs, this relationship with its lethal bite, symbolizing phallic penetration. This term teratophilia defines this, referring to the sexual attraction of monsters. This is common in folklore, as tales involving werewolves and vampires frequently have a sexual undertone. Even while monsters typically prey on humans in stories, their enduring appeal across ages and social classes suggests that there may be something alluring about these made-up interactions for viewers. Despite teratophilia gaining a lot of attention online, its roots are not totally understood. The study of human sexuality has its own subfields within psychology, yet its vast variety is still somewhat of a mystery. It might be for reasons unrelated to teratophilia per se, such as providing some individuals with a means of obtaining sexual fulfillment outside of social norms. According to Freud's psychoanalysis, sexual attraction frequently entails the interaction of opposing emotions, many of which have their roots in early experiences. If a person has a traumatic formative event including physical deformities, they may discover that their adult sexual life is a means of coping with those unpleasant emotions. They might start to feel drawn to people who are an unaccepting society would consider to be physically abnormal. Given that some people view attraction to some stereotypically masculine traits, like dominance and aggression, as harmful, it might even serve as a substitute outlet. Not only are vampires attractive due to their flawless skin and razor-sharp fangs, but their enigmatic aura and notion of unrestricted freedom also captivate people. For the viewers out there watching this and saying, okay, I find myself attracted or rather intrigued, but I'm not into the whole sexual aspect of it all, there's an answer for this too. According to Jung, the guy who introduced the archetype term, collective universal images and motives which come from the collective unconscious are shared by all human psyches. These traits, or archetypes, typically stem from a feeling or experience that is fundamentally to every human psychology. This is how Jung explained why the same beliefs have persisted throughout history, and his findings can offer a very plausible answer in the case of the vampire myth. A primary archetype of the human psyche, according to Jung's theory, is the vampire, who is also sometimes referred to as one of the symbols connected to the archetypal figure known as the shadow, who is one of the most negative archetypes overall. Because of the vampire's emotional and psychological relevance to humans, the picture of the vampire has become ingrained in the collective unconscious of all human brains. This explains why the vampire continues to appear in myth and literature beyond cultural boundaries. Though vampires may seem mythical, there is a lot to them that seems so real. According to Jung, blood is the archetypal symbol for the soul, standing for life. It is evident how the vampire's parasitic take of a person's life energy and soul in order to survive has led to the image of the vampire becoming a psychological archetype for one of humanity's oldest and most fundamental anxieties. The development of the vampire archetype is a reflection of our culture's shifting views on sexuality, power, and the darkness. In the past, vampires stood for the hidden dark sides of the human psyche, the shadow that, if allowed to grow, would devour our souls. They were the embodiment of the forbidden urges, phobias, and wants that were frowned upon by society and treated cruelly. But as our society grew more accepting as individualistic, the vampire began to represent emancipation, empowerment, and revolt. As the ultimate rebels, vampires questioned the status quo and twisted social norms. The vampire myth may have had a different function in addition to being a source of anxiety, as it represents a deep-rooted fear of emotions in the human psyche. Psychologically, despite our fear of this legendary creature, humanity may have welcomed the tale since it seems to hold the solutions to some of the more difficult problems in life. This is evident in the explicitly Christian themes that surround many contemporary vampire myths, including the Christian icon stated earlier that can be employed as a vampire repelling strategy. Given that Freud believed that religion was not based on truth but rather infantile wishes, it is possible that a reaffirmation of religious ideas is contributing to people's obsession with vampires. One of the main themes in vampire narratives is immortality, which presents a serious existential conundrum. Although the thought of living eternally may sound alluring at first, vampires serve as a reminder of the possible emptiness and suffering that come with it. Vampires are left stuck in an endless loop with no sense of fulfillment fulfillment or purpose after they achieve immortality, which takes away the transient beauty of human existence. We are forced to consider the purpose of life and the certainty of death as a result of this existential conundrum, making comparisons between the vampire's predicament and our own mortality. In this context, it may challenge people to consider the nature of our impulses and the price of giving into them unchecked. The vampire has a special ability to speak to the human mind because of the very concerns that led to the development of the vampire as we know it today. In an effort to fit in, vampires frequently have to conceal their actual nature from others, which pushes them to the periphery of society. They have to contend with the reality that feeding upon the life of others is their sole means of survival. They appeal to our innate curiosity about dying and the allure of eternal life. In essence, they achieve the ideal harmony between wish fulfillment and fascinating, sympathetic tragedy. Tragically, they are trapped in time, even though they are practically internal. They have superpowers, strength, and frequently the wisdom that can come with great age, a frequently pessimistic view of life, despite being unable to grow and change like the seasons, or in most cases give birth to new life. Although we want to push the boundaries and strive to be greater, we nevertheless desire to be a part of nature. We can toy with death and the idea of mortality when imagining what it would be like as a vampire. They allowed us to consider what it may entail to live a truly long life. The presence of vampires serves as a sobering reminder of everyone's potential for evil. Their existence blurs the boundaries between human and monster, demonstrating how anyone can give in to their inner urges and transform into a creature of the night in specific situations. It is this reflection of our own fallibility that compels us to face hard realities about human nature. It forces us to admit that mortality and immortality do not always have a sharp border as we would like to think. Vampires force us to examine the nuances of our own desires and the repercussions of giving in to them in this way. Like mentioned earlier with the queer perspective on vampires, these stories are always a good way to explore complicated societal aspirations and worries. They offer a creative and secure environment for discussing matters related to sex, mortality, and the human condition. They free people from the taboos and conventions of society to explore these subjects by employing vampires as metaphors and symbols. They turn into a mirror that we can use to look at our own hopes, goals, and anxieties. Vampires represent a deep-rooted duality present in human psychology. On the one hand, they embody the appeal of the forbidden. They are inherently attractive and captivating. They provide an opportunity to break free from society expectations and a seductive look into a world where wishes are accepted without boundaries. However, vampires also represent the darkest sides of human nature, such as the never-ending conflict between the conscious and instincts, the insatiable hunger, and the desire for power. Because of this duality, which reflects the inner tensions that exist within each person, vampires are likable and complicated characters that reflect our own inner battles. Without a doubt, a lot of vampiric stories that have gained popularity, specifically within the romance genre, are targeted not only towards young girls, but young people in general. I would know, my obsession with vamps started in middle school. Adolescents find the idea of being unique and having unique abilities enticing since they still feel invisible and helpless due to being ruled by their parents and school. Teenagers can relate to the struggle of wanting power, whether it be from vampires or other pieces of fiction that show similar storylines and characters like this. However, because they are witnessing the abuse of power by the older generation, who frequently yields it over them and views rites of passage as illegal, they are often more aware of the dangers associated with power than their parents are. In addition to the previously discussed sexual and emotional components, they are all predators who are frequently trying to live their decent lives despite their craving for blood. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. They may be considered monsters, but they have morals in the end. Mostly. The vampires that so many identify with lets people see themselves more clearly. We can see the moral conflicts that we frequently lose or more frequently ignore, as well as the concessions we make on a daily basis. I am terrified of this dark thing that lives in me, wrote Sylvia Plath. The reason you can't see a vampire in the mirror? The vampire serves as a mirror for our inner selves. We can only hope that these morally tormented vampires would help us see our abuses of power and provide some guidance on how we could try to live more moral lives here on Earth. I'd like to think of this entire video as a great excuse for liking vampiric stories and romances. Sometimes you have to look in the trash for the divine when it's banished from most of our culture. Obviously, this isn't a kind of genre that everyone has to like, but with what's been found, there's nothing entirely wrong with it either. Without a doubt, there may be times when problematic events or concepts may be introduced into vampiric stories, like physical force or worse, but that's also the case for all kinds of fictional content. specifically in dark romance. That doesn't disregard the usage of it nonetheless, and isn't something that should be ignored. So of course, like any other piece of fiction, it's always appreciated when creators and writers can find their way to not include that within the lead couples, even if these stories are classified as dark romances. Of course, I'm not hating. I quite literally have an obsession with vampires in many pieces of media myself. Looking back on what we learned, it's intriguing to see how these stories probably wouldn't have had such an outstanding reaction without the lead that the vampire goes after. Importantly, the heroine of the paranormal romance is an outsider, just like the vampire. The vampire archetype represents our ambivalent attitude toward femininity and the affective domain. Numerous vampire tales depict female characters as the male vampire's objects of passion, vitality, and source of nourishment. This dynamic is a representation of the old patriarchal culture, which treats women as nothing more than objects of male desire, objectifying and devaluing them. Nonetheless, in contemporary vampire novels, female characters have embraced greater agency and authority, subverting conventional gender norms and claiming their individuality and sexuality, who find themselves as outsiders in a world where their demeanor, physical prowess, and supernatural abilities clash with traditional notions of femininity. And even though I may not be a huge fan of the stories that some vampiric characters that I adore are in, specifically plot-wise, this truly is admirable. It can be difficult to keep an open mind on stories you don't understand, nor ones that don't pique your interest, so this entire concept is pretty eye-opening. This is how paranormal fiction has given rise to new fictional universes where vampires may be the other, but are still rather just one of many supernatural characters in a community where everyone, including humans and other monsters, need to figure out how to get along. Paranormal romance suggests that empathy, understanding, and love, no matter how impractical or frightening this may seem, are the keys to a happy ending in our current era of profound social change. And as a personal happy ending for me who loves vampires.